oh, you're just tripping balls. You're just
Right.
going out. Yeah, I will tell you that I've had some visuals, right? But not the stuff that you've seen on TV or the misconceptions that you might have. But more importantly, like it has really allowed me to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that
Right.
that is important. Like if you want to get through stuff, you got to walk through it. And sometimes you just there's a lot of fear there, right? There's a lot of trigger responses there. And so you don't get to do that deep work as you mentioned, and I like that, but you don't get to that point where you are actually doing that deep work. It prevents you. So things like psychedelic assisted therapies, it helps you kind of navigate those feelings. Thank you for tuning in to the Critical Conversations podcast, brought to you by Mind the Frontline. Established in 2023 as a 501c3, Mind the Frontline is your ally in the journey to support those who selflessly safeguard our communities. Their core mission revolves around pioneering innovation and research, education, and overall well-being specifically tailored to healthcare, military, and public service frontline first responders. The Critical Conversation podcast is a dedicated space for police, fire, EMS, allied health workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Here, we dive into the heart of the matter, tackling essential topics such as mental health strategies, recovery methods, treatment options, the latest research, and professional development opportunities. Before we dive into today's episode on Critical Conversations, we do want to, however, acknowledge the nature of our discussions. Some of the content discussed may be triggering or intense as we explore the challenges and the triumphs within the first responder community. We recognize that these discussions may evoke strong emotions or memories. If you or someone you know is struggling and needs immediate support, we urge you to reach out to your agency's mental health resources or your local peer support group. In time of mental health crisis, you can always contact the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline by phone or via text at 988. Please remember you are never alone and help is always available. At Mind the Frontline, we are more than just a podcast. We are a community committed to fostering resilience within the entire first responder family. So whether you're on the front lines or supporting those who are, we invite you to subscribe, engage, and be a part of this vital mission. To learn more, please visit us at www.mindthefrontline.org. Now let's dive into today's critical conversation. Welcome, everyone, to another episode of the Critical Conversations podcast by Mind the Frontlines, the podcast for first responders, mental health advocates, listeners, and Mind the Frontline community members. In this episode, we are going to be discussing psychedelic-assisted therapy, and no, it's not just dope. Our guest speaker on this episode is Eddie Rice. Eddie is a flight paramedic and a neonatal flight paramedic at a local Oklahoma City hospital. He has firsthand knowledge in holistic therapies, recovering from his own TBI and being diagnosed with CPTSD. With his experience, Eddie will share his story of recovery and help educate us in our ongoing mission to inform first responder communities on the holistic mental health treatments and therapies. So let's dive into today's episode and learn more about how psychedelics can help those in recovery. Welcome, Eddie. Thank you so much. I'm really excited to do this episode, especially I love talking about psychedelics. It's something that just doesn't get the love I think it needs and deserves. And I like to give our listeners and our viewers just new ways to kind of think outside the box. We don't always have to put a pill in our mouth. There's other ways and other treatment forms that work for people. It doesn't work for everybody, but I love talking about this specific topic today. So tell us a little bit about yourself and introduce yourself to our viewers and our listeners.
Absolutely, man. Appreciate you having me. Like you said, my name is Eddie Rice. I fly here in Oklahoma City on our neonatal pediatric transport team. Been a paramedic for about 5 years. Started in the fire service, transitioned over to law enforcement before coming back to EMS full time and going the HIMSS route. So what started my mental health walk? A lot of physical, sexual abuse in my childhood. I think that kind of projected me into the chaos of emergency services. About 5 years in, I started noticing the ramp up in anxiety and depression. But what that stemmed from is when I was still in paramedic school. I had worked a long shift. I was driving home, ended up falling asleep at the wheel, having a rollover, which resulted in a frontal lobe TBI. So I'm doing okay with that now. A lot of that has came through the help of using psychedelics, both psilocybin and ayahuasca. But it's been quite the journey to get here.
Yeah, that sounds like it, man. And I think what I'm noticing, at least in our communities, is a lot of us bring some childhood trauma into our professions, beforehand. And while unfortunate that is, it's nice to show our viewers and listeners, that you too can heal your brain, and I like to kind
Right.
of really tell people, there is the possibility of doing that. So, as you were kind of going through, how did you stumble upon, psilocybin? How did you stumble upon ayahuasca as you were kind of looking for ways to heal?
So I started down the traditional route of going to your PCP, which resulted in getting a script wrote for an SSRI. I tried multiple routes along that. That just made me oftentimes more suicidal, more depressed. It just put a piece of plexiglass between myself and my emotions, just allowed me to press it down more. And I got to the point, it was starting to spill over into my marriage. It was starting to spill over into my parenting. And it just got to a breaking point. Like I was either about to have to walk away from my second marriage, walk away from my kids because I couldn't get a grip on myself. And I knew that something had to change at that point. So I was a big listener of the Sean Ryan show. It's another big show out there. And he had done a topic, or we can scratch that part out. He had done a discussion on using psychedelics, and so I began by using psilocybin. It was very helpful. I used a rather large dose for my first trial of it, but it opened me up to more ideas down the DMT route, the ayahuasca route, the ibogaine route. And so I found a center out in Arizona that under religious exemption you can sit for ayahuasca ceremony. And I went out there for 3 days, and I did 3 days back to back of ayahuasca. And it saved my career, absolutely saved my life, saved my marriage, saved my relationship with my kids, all of it.
That's very powerful, Eddie, and I definitely look forward to continuing to explore kind of how that journey went. But I wanted to touch on a couple of things that you had said. A lot of us that go through this trauma therapy, as we experience a trauma or we hit our breaking point, it doesn't just affect the individual, right? It
Right,
affects those around us. I could absolutely kind of relate to some of those things that you were saying. In my darkness and my kind of pit of despair, going through my traumatic experience and not even realizing it, I took out a lot of damage and did a lot of damage to my family, uh,
right,
my wife, my kids. I just wasn't present. I was completely checked out. Was kind of like a walking zombie. And when I was there, I was very irritable. I was very agitated. I was very full of anger and rage, and to the point where it would scare my family. And I look back and it's a it sucks. It sucks the damage that I did, but at the same point, I realize and accept that I had no control. Like my amygdala was just firing away and taking over and just basically hijacked the driver's seat to the point where, you know, I didn't have the control. I didn't even know and realize like, how far down that hole, or into the fog, as I call it, I really, really was. And so I think when we look at exploring some of the science and understanding and the mechanism of psychedelic assisted therapy, we look at the therapy component itself, which involves the use of substance like psilocybin or MDMA, like you mentioned, ibogaine, ayahuasca, and it's used under the trained guidance of therapists to facilitate basically psychological healing and personal growth. And one of the things that I love about holistic therapies as we start having more research come behind it, it really does show that we're able to regrow and reheal our brain, and it gives us that chance of hope. And I think, having that chance of hope or that thought of hope is extremely, extremely powerful, for someone who's looking to recover and try to get out of the mess. Because I know, at least for me, there was two options. It was either you got to figure this out, Chris. Like you got to really figure this out so you can be here, or option two was my two failed suicide attempts, and
right.
I didn't want to have a third one. And so it's like, what do you do? And so I too have practiced psilocybin mushrooms. I have not yet gone and done an ayahuasca journey yet. And it's definitely something on my list because as I continue to recover and continue to heal, like I keep uncovering, more things, more trauma, sometimes childhood, a lot of it with my profession and what I've done in the last 23 years is working in public safety as a first responder.
Right. And I think a lot of the trauma that tends to seep out of us comes from our childhood. You know, we tend to push our work trauma down, and what we don't understand is there's already a foundation built there of everything that we've endured throughout our childhood, whether that be sexual assault, physical assault. Everybody has their own trauma, and then we come into this line of work and we start to add that on top of it and add that on top of it, and before too long, I mean, there's just nowhere for it to go anymore. And so I feel like the traditional SSRI route, you're just essentially putting a plexiglass cap on that to where you can see it, but within your mind with the chemical mediation, you know, you're not responding to it as you would. But this hardest thing for me on this was getting around the label that it had on it. You know, having a history in law enforcement, worked quite a bit of narcotics. You know, I felt like it was all just dope. You know, everything that's outlawed by the government is just dope. And once I got around that, I mean, it opened my eyes to so much. You know, seeing the guys that are coming out of the military and using this stuff, seeing the guys that are coming out of the special operations community and using this stuff, and they're getting their lives back, man. You know, I think there's so many of
Yeah.
us in this line of working in the military that we spend our lives serving others, and it's very noble. You know, it's a good cause, but there comes a point in time that we have to regain our lives. And I think using things such as psilocybin, ayahuasca, and ibogaine is the exact route to do that for some people.
And I want to mention that because there is a stigma around psilocybin, cannabis. We did an episode not too long ago on mind meds and mushrooms, and
Right.
that was actually one of our it still is, I think, one of our leading podcast episodes because people out there, they really want to understand this. And that's what I love about these episodes is really we're able to inform and educate people about what these things really are. And they're not, because I kind of had the same thing, yeah, in high school I was recreationally using cannabis, but when I want to get better and part of my recovery, I got my medical marijuana card and really explored into cannabis. But I had a hard time because at the time I was still flying, I was still an active first responder, and there are fears behind that because what happens if I get a drug test, what happens if this, and am I going to lose my job, do I approach my employer? And it's really hard. I think we as an industry are still navigating that, and not only in first responder and public safety and government. You know, I think a lot of industries are dealing with this. Like, for example, I'm not going to throw them out there, but someone very, very close to me is also, has his medical marijuana card, and he wants to be very transparent with his employer, but at the same time, he's basically worried that if he does, he's going to lose his career. At the same time, the employer is kind of culturally accepting of it, but it's just because some of the contracts that they work on, they just can't, and so it's kind of like, hey, well, where your drug test is. And, while I can appreciate that a little bit, it still doesn't, absolve that individual of risk of potentially losing what they've worked so hard for. And so I do think that we need to have more conversation. I really am hoping legislation, especially at the federal level, is starting to look at these things and really start pushing it. And I love how the VA is leading the way because they have a lot of push up there at the top. They really,
That's
really
right.
do. And so that's why you're seeing psilocybin mushrooms come out. You're seeing ayahuasca is being more considered now, and more than ever. Methylene blue, ibogaine, some of these, medical marijuana, some of these things are really coming out and showing kind of like, hey, and what I like about psilocybin, and we can get into ayahuasca a little bit more, MDMA. But when you look at these things like ketamine, I'm a huge proponent of ketamine therapy. But as we see the research come out, I can show you the research that shows that after one large dose, like you mentioned, of psilocybin mushrooms, that the effects of that, the therapeutics effect of that, can almost go on for almost a year just from one single dose. Whereas with ketamine, I had to go in almost every 2 weeks. And for the first while, there's a ramp up period where you're going twice to three times a week, and it only really lasts about 14 days on average, depending on the person and the study that you read. But at the end of the day, these things are happening and they lead to life altering futures for these people who are struggling. And when we look at the studies, based on like neuroimaging techniques such as fMRI, they have actually shown changes in brain activity patterns associated with the interconnectivity and the increased connectivity between these hemispheres of our brain, that are involved in emotional processing and self-awareness. So, I think the research is there. It's just, how do we generally accept this and, disassociate it from dope like meth or cocaine or heroin, which really don't have any medical kind of efficacy, versus these do. They actually are saving people's lives. They are improving their quality of life. More importantly, people that would have met me, 5 years ago would have been like, dude, that guy's just a straight up butthole,
Right.
and now it's like, I'm more humble. I'm more less reactive. I mean, it really does change. And I call it kind of like you're sloughing off this former exoskeleton, kind of like a snake kind of, coming through, or, a caterpillar turning into a butterfly, however you want to look at it. But the new Chris, man, I love the new Chris, because the old Chris, man, I see him, I'm aware of him, and I don't ever want to go see that guy again.
Right. I think one of the biggest differences that you get with this is it gives you the ability to sit with yourself. Before I began this treatment, everything was a crisis. I was stuck in fight or flight mode. Everything was go, go, go. There was no time just to sit and and reflect, and be engaged with my wife and be engaged with my kids, be engaged with my teammates. It was constantly thinking of the next 15, 20 things down the road just because I was always stuck in such a drive. And I think allowing yourself to go in and just give up control and allowing your nervous system just to get a restart. I mean, that's a way that I look at this stuff. I look at ayahuasca as a engine swap, and then using psilocybin just to do your oil changes. Just to keep your
Mm, I like that. I really do like that
maintenance up.
analogy, man. That was
Right,
that was that was powerful.
right. And so that's I mean, that's the way that I look at it, and I think it's just a great tool, especially if you find yourself to be stuck in that constant fight or flight. That's the biggest thing within the conversations that I have, is it allows your system to just go through a total defrag and come out the other side to where you're back in control. You're the one that's driving your nervous system. It's not your nervous system driving you.
Yeah, it's basically, I mean, and I like how you put it, man. It's like resetting my engine, right? And
Mhm.
sometimes it's like swapping it out for a whole new engine, but I like how you put it that way. It allows you to sit in the shit, because I'll tell
Right.
you guys, like, as you start getting and hopefully finding, treatment, and you're working on yourself in recovery from whatever mental health injury you might have, and it's just an injury. Remember, this is temporary. You have, and studies will back this up, you have the ability to change your brain and heal yourself. It's just doing the work. But at the same time, I like how you kind of put that reset, because it is a reset. You're basically allowing yourself to be comfortable with all of these things that you're not comfortable with. And typically those will trigger that fight or flight response. That amygdala kind of jumps in the driver's seat, takes over, starts hauling ass down the road, punching it and flipping people off, hey, I don't care about anything. And really it allows you to kind of just, hey, I can get in the slow lane, sit behind people in traffic, and be totally okay with it, right? And it allows you to kind of go through those emotions that you have without having that fear. Because if we can tell our brain that, hey, this is safe, it's not really happening, but I can process it. Really, I can open up. I like how Derek Hanley did this with the when we did a podcast not too long ago. But he mentioned like opening up the jars from your backpack, because you put them in, you put everything in a jar, you put it on a shelf, and you show it in this backpack, and it gets heavier and heavier. Well, as we start unpacking our backpack and taking these jars off the shelf and unscrewing them and kind of processing them, a lot of people, and this is what I noticed when I was on SSRIs, and I'm not talking down on SSRIs. Like, sometimes we just need something to give us that bridge to treatment or other treatment modalities. And sometimes it works very successfully in some people. And so that's why I love, talking about the different things that we can do. But at least for me, when I started taking the SSRI, it pushed me a little bit further down into the hole, and those thoughts of self-harm and just sitting in the crap. And it kind of manifested itself after a couple of weeks of using that and therapy and ketamine. And I got my dog Portia. She's here with me right now. Because when I do these episodes, I get triggered myself still, but it's part of my recovery, and I like to be able to kind of do that. But that was a really good analogy, man. I really like that. It's like, hey, got to do an engine swap and then I need some oil changes. And that's
Right.
exactly a good way to look at it. So, how do we break the stigma? When we address some of these misconceptions or myths surrounding psychedelic assisted therapy, what have been some common, stigmas that you yourself have? And maybe just some of those stigmas that you've heard from the community.
I think one that falls heavily on psilocybin, is just the whole magic mushroom theme. You're just taking them to giggle, roll around on the floor, and have fun. And that's absolutely not the case. I mean, there is dosage ranges that will put you in the giggles, I suppose, but it's anything but that, man. Like, I think all of these, if they're approached via an avenue of respect, like, there's not a super high potential for abuse with these things. Like, I didn't walk out of my ayahuasca retreat thinking, "Oh, I can't wait to get my hands on ayahuasca again." Like, it is powerful to the point that you're not going to want to go right back into it. I mean, this puts you in a state of deep work. Like, it's not a magic pill that makes these things just disappear. Like, it allows you to be in your shadow. It allows you to sit in your own shit, and it allows you to start to navigate that, not just push it off to the side, try to sweep it under the rug. Like, it allows you to sit face to face with it, sit with your inner child if that's one of the struggles that you have, and really just start to break it down and navigate it to where it's not a weight in your life anymore.
I like how you put that. Some of the things that I've heard from people is the same thing, like magic mushrooms. Oh, you're just tripping balls. You're just going
Right.
out. Yeah, I will tell you that I've had some visuals, right? But not the stuff that you've seen on TV or the misconceptions that you might have. But more importantly, like, it has really allowed me to be comfortable with being uncomfortable. And that
Right.
that is important. Like, if you want to get through stuff, you got to walk through it. And sometimes you just there's a lot of fear there, right? There's a lot of trigger responses there. And so you don't get to do that deep work, as you mentioned. And I like that. But you don't get to that point where you are actually doing that deep work. It prevents you. So things like psychedelic assisted therapies, it helps you kind of navigate those feelings. It reduces your fight or flight response and that fear, so you can really think about it and go. And what I like about it, and the only way I can kind of attribute to it, at least in some of my experiences, is it's allowed me to kind of really process it and go, is this rational versus irrational? Because what I found is some of the stuff that I was really triggered or scared over, ended up just kind of being irrational stuff, and I just needed to kind of put it in perspective. But because there was trauma involved, like, it's very hard when you're completely present, I would say, to really look at that and break it down, unless you've had, a lot of therapy, or you have a lot of experience with, emotional intelligence, self awareness, all these things, inner child, like you mentioned. That's a lot of commonalities that I see pop up. But when we look at it, when it comes to the stigma behind psychedelic assisted therapies, despite the growing evidence and the supporting efficacies of psychedelic assisted therapies, they continue to face stigmas and misconceptions. It's like, and it's really hard. I live in a state like Utah, that the politicians really just don't understand it. They take
Right.
it the same way. They're like, oh, you're just getting high, when you're talking about medical marijuana. You're just getting, you just want to go trip. Oh, addiction, addiction, addiction. And what I would say is the common myths, including concerns around addiction, psychosis, long-term cognitive impairment, all of those have been debunked if they would
That's
just
right.
look at the science behind it. And then I go, and here's me, just me playing devil's advocate. But then I look at them and I go, okay, but it's okay if I take a Loratab or an Oxy or all this other stuff. Oh, that's legal because look how that's all working out. And there is actual science that says that those drugs kill people and they're highly addictive. And really, why are we using these in the first place? But we can't use some of these other ones that actually. And so you look at big pharma. I do feel like big pharma and what they do with their super PAC groups absolutely staunch and add to the stigma and delay the progress of these holistic treatments because they can't monetize it. It sucks.
Right.
If someone can grow a mushroom in their closet or weed in a cabinet or outside, like, how are they going to get their money? And ultimately it comes down to greed, in my personal opinion. This is just Chris's opinion, by the way, folks. But, take a hard look at it. Like the stigma around there, like psychedelics like psilocybin, MDMA, ayahuasca, they have very extremely low addiction potential. Like some of them almost nearly zero.
Right.
And if you do it in a safely controlled environment, under the guise of a guided therapy, it's extremely safe. And the response and what you get out of that far supersedes anything man-made that we have found.
Yeah, and I would say, if when you look at especially alcohol, a lot of people are using ibogaine specifically to cure alcohol dependency and addiction. So a lot of the argument that I hear is you're just going to take these and get addicted to them. And my response is exactly to the contrary. Like people are using these to break themselves from addictive dependencies to other harmful chemical substances. I think that that's the route that people need to see. It's not people are going to spend the rest of their life in a trip day after day after day. Like the way that these operate is when you're in the psychedelic space and you are beginning to go in excess. I mean, there's entities and things out there that are going to tell you, like, this is your cap, you're done, you're not doing anymore. So I think people need to approach it from this can help cure our addictions to fentanyl and meth and heroin and all the drugs that truly have no good cause, just by taking isolated or just a few treatments of a psychedelic type medication.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like taking Nicorette. When I want to quit smoking, right? And it allows you to step down safely. Similar, to like I don't want to compare it to methadone, but the concept of, okay, we know that I have bad coping techniques. Man, brother, I am an alcoholic. I'm very honest with that. But it's really hard to stop. How do
That's
you
right.
get away from that? When you have such addictive personality and you have drawn yourself to this addictive substance and used it as basically your coping mechanism and your crutches and almost like a wheelchair for me for almost 20 years. I mean, I started drinking when I was 12. And,
Yeah.
and now I can look back because I had a lot of childhood trauma. So that first party I went to and had my first, I remember it was a Budweiser. It tasted like shit. But then it was just Bud, Bud, Bud. And then it just became, hey, every Friday and Saturday night. And then it was like, hey, who can hey, mister, and then I turned 21 and it's like, oh, and I think society looks at it as like, oh, you're 21. It's like you're expected to go on this like bender. But dude, I was already there. I
Right.
just used it as an excuse. And a lot of people, especially in first responders, we know that alcohol plays a huge role in our coping techniques. It's everywhere we go. Conferences. I remember getting off shift at the fire department and going to have breakfast with the team. And guess what? I'm one of a couple ordering morning beers, right?
Right.
And I don't stop at my morning beer. I go in the shower and have a morning case to wake up again, and then
Yeah.
by 5 o'clock I've already finished a bottle. It's just it was horrible. So having things like this where I can actually, and it has been extremely helpful in my recovery using psilocybin. And it's also the reason why I don't do ketamine anymore. It just, I get a lot more benefits out of the psilocybin than I did the ketamine. With ketamine, I had to have a driver. I had to, go into this thing. Insurance is a huge nightmare when you're trying to deal with ketamine, because most oftentimes, like Blue Cross Blue Shield, this is what I had at the time, they would only pay for the first hour, but you're in there for 2 hours being monitored, and
Right.
then I got to get a ride there. I got to get a ride back. And uh, doing something like psilocybin where I can do it in the safety of my own home and my own personal space where I already feel safe because it's normal to me. Or, at least for me, I like to kind of go outdoors. So you'll see me kind of go out and go camping with my dog and get into a safe space because the outdoors for me is extremely safe. That's where I thrive. I love the sunshine. I love just being out in nature. And I'll take these psychedelics and I'll just sit there next to the fire with my hot chocolate or tea or Diet Coke or whatever I brought with me and my dog, Portia. And dude, I wake up the next morning just feeling so rejuvenated. And it's like I've gotten this new energy and I didn't have to go and do all this stuff. But yeah, it's not legal out here in Utah. So I do run that
Right.
risk. And it's a risk that I'm just willing to take because the risk of not doing something like that. And I'm not saying, hey, okay, I have the ketamine option, because that's what people are going to throw out there. I know it's coming, so keep it coming,
Right.
folks. But ultimately, I want to be able to dictate my care based on what I know and what works for me. And just because some politician says that hey, Chris, like, you can't do this, it's illegal. Like, I'm going to take the risk of it, because guess what? Like, the other risk is I fall back into my alcoholism. I fall back to old Chris. I fall back into suicidal tendencies and thoughts and ideations and self-harm. And man, I don't want to go back there. So I'm willing to take the risk, and hopefully, if I have to, plead my case if it ever comes to that. And hopefully it doesn't. But I do know, like, states like Utah, it's currently on the bill to pass psilocybin mushrooms, methylene blue. I haven't heard anything about ibogaine yet, but I'm sure it's out there.
Yeah, I think they're all coming. But I think that that's, just a risk or a risk and assessment that everybody has to take, depending on what state you're in, I think there's a cost that your piece comes at, and regardless of your line of work, whether it be in flight or on the ambulance or on the fire truck or in a police car, I think you owe it to yourself to at least have the open mind to say, where could this take me, even if you're not actively in crisis, like, you don't deserve to live a life of just outside of being in crisis. Like, there's a whole wellness element to this work that we do. And it's not just to keep you one step outside of being in complete left field, and having to go inpatient, things like that.
Yeah, go inpatient. I mean, how much does a divorce cost?
Right.
How
Right.
much is continual therapy for the childhood trauma I'm projecting onto my kids?
Right.
What does that cost?
Right.
For me, that is a price I do not want to pay.
Right.
And that was part of my risk assessment. And, hopefully episodes like this and having these really true conversations and transparent conversations around these episodes, I do hope it gets to some politicians or some decision makers. But more importantly, the more that we talk about it, the more it becomes a subject that people can't run from or hide or put a stigma around anymore. So I challenge everybody listening or watching this episode, you know, continue to help us smash the stigma. I know that's kind of like a cliche phrase, but really, if you're not talking about it and you're not bringing it up in conversation, you're not posting about it on social media, it's not getting the attention that it needs, which means it's not going to get the traction that it needs to actually make a difference for those of us who are suffering. And so I think if you are a sufferer and you have gone down these routes, like, you probably can relate to what we're talking about. You're like, heck yeah, let's go, let's go to the legislator, let's go, hang out on the front steps and picket, because we really do, because we're dying. We're dying in thousands and droves over here, and it's not getting any better. And the treatments that we currently have, while they may be working, and they're not really, in my opinion, holding the line, because we do have more smash the stigma, hey, more awareness, all this stuff going on, but the suicide rates are still climbing, folks. Like, they're not going down, they're not holding, they're not reversing, more importantly. So we do need to think outside the box. And I do hope that things like this not only help first responders, but they help our general public, because we know that mental health right now in the nation, it is a big problem. And I can tell you this because here's my shameless plug I do for every episode. When you look at trying to get into a therapist right now, your average wait time, depending on where you are in the nation, is about 4 to 8 weeks. So if you don't have a therapist, I highly encourage you, like I say with every episode, please start looking for a therapist, someone that you can talk to. I don't care if it's once a year, twice a year, once a month, like, but trying to find that someone now and doing some pre-planning on yourself, in case that moment does come. You don't want that moment to come where you don't want to sit in the shit and you don't know how to react. And hopefully, I hope someone comes for you, but oftentimes, like, you're doing this in silence. And I don't want you to sit 4 to 8 weeks in silence just to get into a therapist, where if you had someone already ahead of time, you could just call and hopefully get their next available. And the thing is a lot of people that we're seeing, at least on the peer support side on here at Mind the Front Line, is a lot of them don't have therapists and they have never been to a therapist. And so I know the challenges that they're going to go through. And it's one of the reasons why we've created the foundation and the organization, is just to help inform people. So, take care of yourself, get yourself out there, just like you'd pre-plan for a mission going out, whatever that looks like. You go out and pre-plan a structure. If you're a firefighter, start pre-planning your mental health, and more importantly, start working on your mental health and wellness every day. It should be just like, it should have as much value as sleep, much value as your diet and as much value as your physical fitness. I would say all four of those are really pillars. And if you are doing all four of those, more than likely, you're probably in a lot better place.
And I would add to that, especially local here, we're helping some folks get in to see some therapists. And I would just add that it's not a one and done, one stop shop. Like it's very likely that you're going to go through 3 to 5 therapists before you find one that you jive with to a degree that you're going to walk in there and spill your shit to them. So I would put in that legwork up front. That way, when you get into a spot or a moment that you need it, you're not starting that process then and dragging yourself out months on end before you get to somebody qualified to talk to you.
100% agree. I think I went through 4 or 5 before I found mine, and
Yeah.
I'm thankful I found mine. Like, she actually has experience, and she's culturally competent. And it's kind of like dating. You're going to go to someone, you're just going to be like, this really isn't working out. Is it you? It's not you, it's me. But yeah, then you got to wait another 4 to 8 weeks to get into somebody else. And so once again, starting that search now is absolutely beneficial. It's not a matter of if, it's a matter of when you're going to have one of these moments where you really need to work out to somebody, because life's going to come down on you, and it's going to come down hard. And if you don't have good coping techniques and you don't have good emotional intelligence and awareness, it's gonna knock you on your ass. And I'm just gonna be honest with that. So tell me, now that we've kind of hopefully talked a little bit more about the stigma and encourage people to kind of help us with uh, smashing the crap out of that, tell me about some real life applications. So tell me about your success story, and kind of your journey with ayahuasca when you went out to Arizona and sat. Can you talk a little bit about that? Do you feel comfortable?
Sure, man. Yeah. So, like I said, that was at a point that marriage was on the fritz. The wife and I were separated at that point. Wasn't getting to see my kids, so I needed a huge pivot. So the day it came across my computer screen was 6 days before I arrived out there. I went and bought plane tickets, jumped on an airplane, went out to Tucson, and this took place out in the middle of the desert. It's a Peruvian-based organization that comes up and provides ceremony. So I went out there. I got there the day of, um, and then went out and parked in front of the place for about 4 hours, thinking about turning around and going back to the airport. It's one of those things that you get there and there's a lot of doubt of what you're about to walk into, because it's not like me just to go randomly jump on an airplane by myself, fly out to a bunch of people that I don't know, and partake in one of the most powerful psychedelics in the world. But so
Yeah.
I get out there, end up getting in. It's in a tent or a hut of sorts out in the middle of the desert. The first night there was about 40 of us. Some people are there was a good part of them that we were all there for our first time, and then there was some repeat folks there. And so once the sun went down and it was nighttime, ceremony started, and went up and partook. The first night, I just took one serving of the ayahuasca, and all the folks were surrounding the hut on mats, so you were just in a huge circle of folks. And took the serving. I went back to my mat. There was a fella, there was a copper miner on one side of me, and then I had a ER physician on the other side. So that kind of tells you the caliber of folks that are there. Um,
Diversity.
Diversity, yeah. So went back, and I would say it's about 45 minutes or so. Started to take effect. It was very, very quick on. So I was laying back, I was looking at the ceiling, and I noticed that the ceiling, where all the beams came together, start to turn. And it was like the first lesson that had came to me, and it was like, and it would turn to a point, and it was like it was getting stuck. And then it was just like sometimes you really just have to learn to let go, and that's what the message was. It was sitting there getting stuck, and it was just the imagery of my mind. I'll go to a point and I'll get stuck, and this is going to a point that's getting stuck, and that's the time that I chose. Just full surrender, let it go. Let's see what this medicine can do. And that first night, as soon as I did that, it spun the whole way. It looked like a massive tornado was in the middle of this hut. Very heavy on the visuals the first night, and then I went into the part that it's very common to purge, especially on ayahuasca. Some people vomit, some people do it the other route. But whenever you get there, you get your own little personal bucket. And so then I turned to the bucket. I didn't vomit, but there was fluid that looked like it was coming out of my face, and it was very black tar-like fluid just dripping down into this bucket. And in hindsight, I feel like that was a lot of the trauma that was coming out. And so that happened for what I would say about an hour. Then I finally did purge, and then I blacked out for probably 2 hours, and woke up, and I felt like I had been in an absolute fist fight. And that kind of transitioned out the first night. You do it from about 11 o'clock at night until the sun comes up, is kind of the way that they do it there. And so by that time, the sun had came up. So there wasn't anything totally remarkable that first night. I think there was a lot of prep work that first night. So I went back to the hotel and slept. Came back the second night. Second night was pretty heavy. The second night I took 2 servings. Was sitting on my mat, and then 11-year-old me, which is the age of my inner child, where a lot of my stuck stuff was, just nonchalantly comes walking in the tent, sits on my mat, and there's about a 4-hour conversation that takes place there. And it's full, of forgiveness and all of this shame that I used to carry around, and the self doubt and the feeling of being an imposter in everything that I do. There was about 4 hours of conversation there that I had with what looked like a very tangible, 11-year-old child. And at the end, we hugged, and he ran out of the tent. Um, the reason that the running part is important is when I was 11, that age, I found my grandma dead on the couch. My grandma's who I lived with because both my parents were in prison. And so whenever I found her like that, I just took off out the front door and I started running. And that's something that I always blame myself for, is not knowing what to do. Hence why I'm a paramedic now. So I always, know what to do in those situations. But I never forgave myself for running until that night. And when I gave that kid a hug, I was like, man, it's okay to run. And he turned around and he ran off. And to this day, I mean, it's still there, it's still present, but it's not as heavy and as controlling, having that dynamic with my inner child. So that was a big part of the second night. And then the third night was very, I would call it violent. Um, Went in, had 1 serving, and before I had went in, before I'd left the hotel for the third night, I was going through my bag, and I found this bullet in my bag, and it had made it all through the airport. Nobody said anything about it, didn't get shook down for it, so it made it out there. And I realized that I had put this bullet in my bag the night after I had stuck a gun in my mouth. And this was probably a year prior. No, this is 2 years prior to going out for this ceremony. And I stuck that in my bag, just to always have with me, kind of a dark type deal. And so the leading up to the third night, I walked out into the desert and I threw that bullet out into the desert. And so the third night I went in, I just had 1 serving, and it was right at the hour mark because they ring a bell after the hour, and then you can go up and get more. But right as that bell rang, like my body just took this face down position. My ankles were crossed, my hands are on the back of my head. Oftentimes, how in law enforcement you take people into custody, right? You put them at the point of maximum surrender, and that's how I found myself that night. My forearms were squeezing my head to the point I thought I was going to explode, but it was just balls and balls of energy coming out of me, and all of that trauma releasing. Like I could feel myself getting lighter. I felt like I was particles of the dirt, like not even a human structure anymore, just particles of the dirt, and I felt all of that just leaving my body. And after I'd say 5 hours of that, I was able to stand up again. And so stood up and walked outside and kind of wandered off into the desert. And there was a pack of coyotes that were howling, and all of a sudden they came quiet. And I didn't have any idea of where I positioned myself, but all of a sudden, this voice of what I chalk up to being God, my God, it just said, although you walk through the valley of the shadow of death, you shall fear no evil or although because my God is always with me. And it said, if you think that's just a Bible verse, you need to lift your head up. And when I lifted my head up, man, I was looking down a valley, and it was like dead vegetation and live vegetation, and then some water, and then this mountain. And at the top of this mountain was my wife standing with my kids, with her arm around them, and I just broke into a bag of shit at that point, just face down. Did that for a couple hours, and that was the last night. But it was just so profound, and it takes all of the noise out of life, man. All of the distractions of every day and text messages and emails and going through this, and it really brings back in what we're here for. I'm not here to be a people pleaser. I'm not here to occupy every hour of every day with something to do. I'm here to lead those children, and I'm here to lead that woman, and I'm here to lead them towards God. And after that, man, we had like a little breakout breakfast, and I walked back to the hotel, went to the airport, and flew back home. And it's been history ever since. But it saved my life. It saved my career. Reignited my compassion for other people. Although I'm flying little babies now, I'm still not too hip on the adult stuff. But yeah, it's a crazy ride. I mean, you have to go into it with a level of open-mindedness, and the more you try to control it, the more it's going to bring you to your knees.
That is
So
just powerful, brother.
yeah,
Absolutely powerful.
yeah,
Like it brought me to a little bit of tears, and that's okay, man. It's just I could feel the emotion in that story and
yeah,
your share. That I really do appreciate the transparency.
yeah.
Looking back, is there any doubt in your mind that you'd never go do this again, or you wouldn't recommend it to anybody, or did you get that much value out of it that you really do kind of vet the process now?
No, I would absolutely vet the process, especially for psilocybin and ayahuasca. On the ayahuasca front, I wouldn't say it's something that you use your means to acquire and you try to do at home. I wouldn't say it's a medicine that you do under the guide of
Excellent.
yourself. But there's shamans out there, practitioners out there and there's plenty of places in the states that you can find to go. But yeah, I would recommend it
Yeah.
to everybody.
I would highly recommend not doing ayahuasca by yourself. Like it
Yeah,
needs to be a guided therapy and
yeah,
under the guise.
and
Doing that on your own
and
can be extremely dangerous.
yeah, and if you're not so much a people person, there's options to get one-on-one ceremonies to where the shaman and you can meet at a specific location and do it that way.
Nice.
Yeah,
Well, if you're listening or you're watching this, we'll try to put some links in the comments and the show notes. That way, you guys can also kind of, you know, have that experience, look into it, and see if it might be an option for you. But I do know that when you look at some of the most leading institutions behind research, such as John Hopkins University and the Imperial College of London, they have demonstrated significant reductions of symptoms of depression, anxiety, PTSD following psychedelic therapies such as ayahuasca and psilocybin mushrooms. And those personal accounts that you just heard, folks, from people like Eddie, are ones that I hear over and over and over again, especially for those who have tried other means of therapy and still have not gotten the level of relief that they're looking for. I never, I'm one to always say, KFG, keep effing going. And the
mhm,
reason why is you shouldn't accept, just where you're at. If you're not there, you feel like you still need, and you still have a journey to go and you still need to do some walking, keep looking out for other therapies that are out there. But when you see these personal accounts, these healing experiences that I'm hearing from people like Eddie, um, they're truly success stories. Because when you look at the tangible benefits of psychedelic-assisted therapy, they inspire. This story is inspiring for me because I still have unresolved trauma, and I know that. Ayahuasca has been, I'll be front and honest. I'm fearful of it. I'm fearful of facing my demons. I really am. And I come off as maybe this kind of bigger guy with some machismoism, but a lot less now than if you knew me 5 years ago. But honestly, like that's my biggest fear is what am I going to encounter? But when I keep hearing people like you that say, "Hey, yeah, like this was my experience. It's pretty heavy, but when I walked out of that, like I really like your analogy of like shedding off your trauma like into this bucket. That to me is powerful. Like that, I want to shed this shit out. I want to go sweat it out and get it out of here because it's extremely toxic. And I've tried other things with my depression and things like that, and I still know that I'm still working through my very heavy childhood trauma, and it'll always be there. And then I compound that with a lot of the trauma that I got on the job, and I've had some extremely traumatic moments, back to back to back to back, for days on end, and it just didn't stop. And so I know I still have a long way to go in my journey of recovery and healing, but these things, like what your story gives me hope, man. It allows me. I'm like, okay, I guess I need to just put this on the calendar and get on a freaking plane like Eddie did, and just be okay. I'm gonna go hit it. So I think
Yeah,
you've given me
that's
that
how I had to
inspiration.
be, man. Because if I had any, time gap in there to sit there and think about it, I know that I would have found a way to talk myself out of it. I knew that it didn't fall in front of me for just by coincidence, and I knew that I had to act and act now, and it was the best thing I ever did.
What, if you don't mind sharing, you don't have to share or disclose this if you don't want to, but like what would be the typical cost? Because I know some people are kind of looking at that, because when we look at our field, I know there's some, professions, physicians that might be listening, things like that, but there's also EMTs and things like that are cost prohibitive, and so
Sure.
how did the cost impact you?
So I did the 3 nights back to back to back. When you bundle them like that, they give you a little discount per night. But I paid around 350 per night that I was there, plus airfare to get there. My airfare was a little steep just because it was so close from the time I bought tickets to the time I left. But I was all in for about $1,000.
All right,
Or
dude,
no,
that
yeah, yeah,
I think I've spent well over that in just, therapy this year so far. So,
yeah,
um,
yeah.
that's good, and we'll put some information for those, and we typically do a blog around these episodes, folks. So if you are listening to this, more than likely the blog is out. You guys could always go over to www.mindthefrontline/resources. We typically put all of our blogs there. If you're a member, you have a complete library of cataloged episodes like this, videos, resources. If you're not a member, we do put these episodes and make them general public for 30 days before they deactivate. It's just our way to get the information out. But I highly encourage you, if you're not a Mind Shield member, please become a member today. It goes to support these podcasts. It goes to support our peer support initiatives, and really just educating and doing the things that we like to do in our community. So, and it's only $50 a year, and it gives you a resource to really kind of help, provide you that guidance that you might be looking for of taking care of your mental health and wellness almost every day. So, looking at the next kind of moving into the next kind of topic, Eddie, I want to kind of talk about, integrating psychedelic-assisted therapy, and exploring its kind of role in a more of a comprehensive medical treatment, mental health kind of treatment program. And you mentioned, in that analogy with like engine swap versus, hey, this is my oil change. How do you see psychedelic assisted therapy having the potential to kind of complement existing mental health treatments and modalities?
I think you're seeing a lot, especially on the psilocybin front, of the microdosing type regimens. People are doing like your 48 on, 24 off type styles, and integrating that. But I say that people that utilize talk style therapy with a micro or macro dose psilocybin approach, that's been shown to be pretty helpful.
Yeah, at least for me, every now and then it's a macro dose, and then I use the micro dosing to kind of, as maintenance for me.
Mhm.
Just to kind of, those macro doses, I really kind of, it's kind of similar. It doesn't seem like it's near as intense as the ayahuasca therapy that you went through. If anybody's done my macro, it's kind of, it gets heavy, but you're really
Yeah,
kind of unpack, like that's when I'm trying to unpack shit.
right.
And then the microdosing are, it's allowing me to kind of live, until the next time I want to go unpack stuff, and it
Yeah.
allows me to kind of heal. But I do see like integrated approaches that combine psychedelics with psychotherapy, mindfulness practice, lifestyle interventions, It really is. It's work. You know, when people think about this, it's not a light switch. There's not a magic pill. It's not a magic weight loss pill. It's like going to the gym or preparing yourself for a Ragnar or a Tough Mudder, or a big sporting event. Like, you have to put in the practice and the work if you want to see the results. And the only person that can really make you do that is you. You know, I think all of us here as your brothers and sisters, we encourage it. We absolutely encourage it, and we're here to help guide you. You know, if you ever need help or you want to debrief with somebody, just call 866 mind 24/7. That is our debrief hotline, and you can talk to some of our peer support people, and just kind of allow things to kind of flow off you. But I do think it takes a totality of approaches, and what works for me, like, and where I started with my mental health recovery and versus where I am now. I've shed some things off and I've added some new things, and some things are still with me, and so I think as you experience that and you work on yourself, you kind of get the feel of what works versus what doesn't work. Like, I know ketamine therapy is there if I need it, and I know what some of those indications would be. SSRIs, like, I'm happy to report, like, through my recovery and a lot of things I've been doing, I'm not on any meds right now. And I'm really, really happy with that, because I didn't like some of the negative effects that they had on me. And so being able to shed those off has actually been great. And to be here and kind of, there's days I'm triggered, but hey, at least I'm aware of it and I know it, and I
Yeah.
can go, hey, okay, it's all right. I didn't have those tools beforehand. And so I think if you're looking for tools, like, this is just another thing to consider in your toolbox of things that might work. It doesn't work for everybody. It may not be for everybody, but at the same time, you got to arm yourself with knowledge. Knowledge is power. So, keep looking into these things. When you look at the research, it also suggests that, like, psychedelic therapy sessions can also catalyze, profound insights and emotional breakthroughs, which I can attest to. Um, I would do my ketamine therapy sessions, and then I would go right over to, after my 2 hours, I go right over to my therapist and have a therapist session, right, to
Yep.
work through stuff. And so I wholly suggest, if you want to get the maximum treatment benefit out of some of these holistic therapies, is try to combine them with some sort of guided therapy, or, speaking with a therapist either before or after to help you kind of through your treatment plans and incorporating these things into your routine. So, what about the future direction? Like, where do you see, like, research, innovation, stuff like that going? Where do you see the impact, the potential impact, really, right now, of psychedelic assisted therapy on first responder mental health? Do you think, organizations like the IFF or the law enforcement associations, do you really think they're going to get behind some of this stuff, or are they just kind of waiting in the background for the feds to make a decision? Or what are your
I think
thoughts?
over time you'll have some of your big names get behind it, but I think that's what everybody's hiding behind right now is the fact that there's still a federal ban on it. So nobody wants to really go out and be that rebellious to the fact. But I think as there's more conversations and we see it state by state, I think we'll we'll see some bigger names start to get behind it. I think once it gets legalized too, there'll be a lot more money to fund the research. I think that's one thing that's hanging it up right now is just the lack of funds to be able to do the extensive amount of research that you need. There's some out now. All of it is very promising, but I think in the long term, we're going to need much, much more.
Yeah, we're definitely going to need some bigger data sets and more people kind of going through this, and also tracking long term, right? Hey,
Right.
how are the benefits? 30 days, 90 days, 1 year, 2 years, 6 years. It would be great to understand, what some of these treatments do to keep people in our profession, because we're also kind of going through a shortage. Like, the average lifespan of a medic right now is 5 to 7 years before they get burned out and they leave the industry altogether and don't come back, folks. Like, they're gone. Like, that's a
Yeah.
resource that you no longer have available to you. So if we're able to extend that, to 10 to 15, like, I see some of these folks that, they make it to 20, 30 years. I'm like, how the hell did you
Right.
do
How
that?
did you
And they
do
probably
that?
didn't make it. They probably didn't make it unscathed, but when I look at least the studies that I'm looking at, they more than likely did not have childhood trauma when they got into the profession. They did have good, healthy coping techniques that were instilled to them as a child or a teenager. Like, they had those tools of resiliency before they got into this field. And so they were able to navigate it and weather the storms. Whereas, someone like me, I didn't have that. I had everything against me. First, I had childhood trauma. I didn't have good coping skills. Nobody instilled any emotional intelligence into me. My inner child is about 7 years old, 8 years old, and it's like a little toddler. and that's how I behave sometimes. And I took that into this, along with like an ego and a machismoism to hide behind. And really, that was just kind of like my armor to like, hey, you guys really can't see what's really hurting me inside. And some of the stuff I didn't even realize it was still hurting me, because you forget about some of these things as a kid. So, um, I do hope that we continue to have these conversations and more people are kind of, at least getting attuned to it, because that's where we start breaking down. Then we get this research and go, okay, well, how do we help the people that come into it? I also think out of this research, you're going to start seeing some of these, some of the research, hopefully, follow some of my suspicions, which is, if they have childhood trauma, we should probably, there should be some sort of screening process, as people come into public safety, to really screen them for, do they have good emotional resilience? Do they have, do they have unresolved childhood trauma? And I'm not saying that would bar them from employment. I'm just saying it would make them aware. Like if I had a cancer screening tool that told me like I have a high chance of being, having cancer if I keep doing this, then maybe I'm, at least I'm armed with knowledge. And then at that
Right.
point, it's up to me to make that decision as a person. But if I came into a profession and said, hey, get a screen, it's like, hey, you have a high instance that you're more likely going to get CPTSD and you'll become a substance abuser and all this other shit that comes with it, you know, at least it makes me aware of it. And then I could decide if I want to, A, hopefully start working on that, B, not even deal with it. And we know how that goes. Or C, just write it out. I don't know, but I do think what we do or what we see as kids is really bringing in a lot of that stuff into our professions. And that's why it might be, and once again, this is just Chris's speculation, his theories, but, I do see commonality in trends when people share with me. And so I kind of put two and two together and go, well, maybe, and that's what a lot of medicine is. It's kind of like, well, it seems like if we did this, this would work, and then we got to go test that out. And that's where the research comes in. And that's kind of, we're getting some of these clinical trials underway, which would be great. But in order to do that, we really do need the federal government and the government at the state level to start at least releasing some of these things for medical use. And so that way we can clear the way to start having the research, right? There's no research with cannabis because it was illegal. So nobody wanted to touch it because they're like, oh, if we do research on this, we possibly get shut down, thrown in jail, all this stuff. But if we can at least start in that next little step and say, hey, we can see some medical efficacy. There are trials out there. There is good research. It does need to be bigger and we need to do more of it. But we have enough to at least say, hey, for medical purposes, we can at least start allowing the research on it, hopefully even the use of it. And
Right.
now that gives us more data because you can't get data when people aren't using it legally. Anyways, they don't want to be that open. They don't want to just come out and go like, yeah, sign me up for that trial. I'm totally breaking federal law. you know,
Right.
I know
That's
a lot of the
exactly it.
law enforcement or military, yeah, a lot of military members, they're probably like, yeah, I ain't going to say a damn word. And I get it. I understand why, luckily, I have uh, that capability. I don't, I work for myself for the most part right now. I'll be going back to the fire service here shortly. So, but I've had some really good, transparent conversations with the administration, and they're 100% on board with what we're doing and how I'm doing it. And so, that gives me once again a safe place, and once again why I chose to work for this agency. And so, uh, that's going to continue through avocation. So you got to be an advocate, guys and gals. You got to get out there. You got to talk about some of these things and let people know like there's other options out there. Having to talk around mental health and wellness just in general, like I want to normalize it. So, hey, as we're doing a shift brief, like, if it's a changeover or whatever that looks like I can really talk about like, yeah, I feel like shit. I'm super depressed today. Like, and what you will find is probably when I go back and I start working for the service, like there's going to be some, some of those things and tools I'll be able to bring into that and really allow people to be honest. Because guess what? If I was a captain, and I knew that someone was having a rough day emotionally, I'm going to do some other things to kind of help them out along the way and maybe even give them some tools. Hey, let's all do meditation in the bay instead of work out today. Let's go have
Right.
quiet time. Let's go read a book. There's other things you can do. So I think just trying to see how it works, and where psychedelic assisted therapy is going. I feel like it is a catalyst, and it does have an exploding potential to really revolutionize mental health care if done correctly. We got to get some of the red tape out of the way.
Yeah, I think a good way to look at it across the board with these is it allows you to peel the veil back. You know, the veil that you let get in your own way, and that veil consists of like your ego and your pride and your bravado and all of those things. I think having access to a medicine that allows you to peel that back and really sit with the parts of yourself that you don't particularly like or that don't particularly need to be there. I think giving people access to that is going to be huge.
Agreed. Well, I really appreciate you coming on, Eddie, and being as transparent as you have to educate us on ayahuasca and just using, psychedelic assisted therapy. Do you have any other closing thoughts that you would kind of like to share with the viewers and listeners about, ayahuasca, about mental health, anything? This is kind of your platform.
Yes, absolutely. Don't jump on it just because it's a buzzword. It is pretty popular right now. A lot of people finding help through psychedelics, but be sure to still do your own homework and do your own research. It's not for everyone. So just be sure you do your work on the front end to make sure it's going to be helpful for you. And then with all of these psychedelics, I would just say approach it with an open mind. Don't approach it with any other opinion that's been told to you or that you formulated on your own. These are very, very powerful plants, very powerful medications, and they can do very powerful things for you. But you have to approach them with a degree of respect.
100%. I love how you put that caveat in there. Definitely do your homework, ladies and gentlemen. Please look into it, and make sure, and if you do have a mental health professional, maybe bounce it off of them, bounce it off of your community members, your fellow, whoever you feel comfortable with to talk about this and go, hey, would this work for me? Never should you jump in and do something because it's a buzzword, that just usually does not end well. I'm not saying it can, but definitely do your homework. It will better prepare yourself for this. So, as we come to another episode, come to the end of another episode and an enlightening episode that was inspiring, Eddie, of Critical Conversations by Mind the Frontline. We'd like to express our sincere gratitude to Eddie for sharing his experience, sharing his story, being transparent. And I really just can't thank you enough, brother, for all you do in the first responder community for mental health and wellness, especially being a volunteer with Mind the Frontline. We really do appreciate all the work that you're doing behind the scenes. Your knowledge definitely elevates our mission, which is promoting the mental health and wellness and recovery of first responders and educating them, more importantly, on what is out there. What are some of these diseases, what they can look for, giving them the tools to be resilient and educate. Because if we can educate ourselves, we can become more resilient and we can heal our brain. So let's continue to have these critical conversations together and build a stronger, more resilient first responder community. Thank you again for being part of Critical Conversations by Mind the Frontline. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and mind the frontline. To our dedicated listeners, thank you again for joining us on this critical journey. Remember, the Critical Conversations podcast is a steadfast resource for police, fire, EMS, allied healthcare workers, dispatchers, air medical, and military personnel, along with their families. Your support makes the impact of these conversations resonate even further. If you found today's discussion enlightening and want to stay connected with our ongoing mission, please be sure to subscribe to the Critical Conversations podcast. You can find us via Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, and the Mind the Frontline website. Your subscription ensures that you will never miss an episode, and it's a powerful way to show your commitment to fostering resilience within the entire first responder community. For more information and additional resources, visit our website at www.mindthefrontline.org. Together, let's continue these critical conversations and build a stronger, more resilient first responder family. We thank you for being a part of the Critical Conversations podcast. Until next time, take care, stay strong, and mind the front line.